I still remember that night like it was yesterday. It was supposed to be just another routine trip, nothing out of the ordinary. But I had no idea what was waiting for me. I had been driving for hours, far from home, on an empty stretch of highway in rural America. I'd been to this part of the country before, but never this late at night. The endless dark, the occasional flicker of lightning, and the heavy clouds made everything feel wrong. I needed to stop for gas, and that's when things went downhill fast. I was already exhausted, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I hadn't passed any other cars for what felt like ages. The only sign of life was the dimly lit gas station that appeared like a beacon in the distance. It was an old place, weathered by time, with a small convenience store attached to it. As I approached, I noticed the station looked somewhat abandoned. No other cars in sight, just the soft buzz of the flickering lights. My gut told me to keep going, but I was running low on gas, so I didn't have much of a choice. I pulled up to the pump and got out of my car. The chill of the night air hit me immediately. The place seemed too quiet. No sounds of crickets or wind, just an eerie silence. The gas station had a broken-down feel to it, like it hadn't been maintained in years. The windows of the store were dirty, and there was a flickering neon open sign above the door that barely worked. Still, I went inside, hoping to grab a snack and get back on the road as quickly as possible. The moment I stepped through the door, a strange odor hit me, like stale coffee mixed with something rotten. There was no one behind the counter, but I could hear the faint sound of footsteps from somewhere in the back of the store. I waited a moment, unsure whether I should call out or just leave. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a figure walking out from the back room. He was tall, wearing a dirty gray jacket, his face obscured by a baseball cap. He didn't seem to notice me at first, and that unsettled me more than anything. I was standing there, just waiting for him to acknowledge me, but he kept moving as if I weren't there. "Hey," I finally said, my voice shaky. "You work here?" He turned, his face still hidden, but he nodded slowly. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite place. His movements were stiff, mechanical, like he was following a script. "Just need gas," I added awkwardly, trying to break the tension. He grunted in response and disappeared back into the back room, leaving me standing there alone. The longer I stayed in that store, the more uneasy I felt. The shelves were half stocked with dusty goods, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed incessantly. I tried to distract myself, scanning the shelves for something to buy, but nothing looked appealing. And then that's when I heard it, the sound of something scraping against the floor from the back room. I froze. It was a slow, deliberate noise, like furniture being dragged across the floor. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, just waiting for something to happen. A few minutes later, the man returned, this time with a strange, almost vacant expression on his face. His eyes didn't seem to meet mine. They just drifted past me, staring at nothing in particular. "You okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm fine," he replied, but his voice was hollow, almost robotic. "Just need you to pay for the gas." I nodded quickly, glad to have an excuse to leave. As I handed him my card, I couldn't help but notice something strange. He wasn't looking at the card. Instead, his gaze seemed fixed on something just behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see something, but there was nothing, just the dim lights, the aisles of products, and the deep shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally far. I hurriedly paid and walked back to my car, feeling a strange sensation crawling up my spine. As I pumped gas, I glanced around, half expecting someone or something to appear from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the sound of the pump clicking as the tank filled. When it was done, I quickly returned the nozzle and got into my car, eager to leave. But as I started the engine, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. The gas station attendant was standing just inside the store, watching me. His eyes were wide, too wide, like he had been waiting for this moment. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at me, and it made my blood run cold. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't figure out what. I quickly pulled out of the gas station, my heart racing. But as I drove further down the highway, I realized something even more terrifying. My gas gauge was still empty. It hadn't moved. Panic flooded over me, and I slammed my foot on the pedal, trying to get as far away from that place as possible. Minutes passed, and I could feel the car slowing down. I glanced at the dashboard again. The needle hadn't budged at all. My car wasn't running out of gas. It was like the fuel was being drained at an impossible rate. My pulse quickened as I scanned the dark road ahead, searching for any sign of another gas station. But there was nothing. Suddenly, my headlights flickered, and the car jerked, losing power. It coasted to a stop in the middle of the road. Panic surged through me as I tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. My phone had no service, and the thought of being stranded here in the middle of nowhere with no one around made my stomach drop. I was stuck. I sat there staring out into the endless night, hoping for someone to come by, but nothing happened. Time seemed to stretch on for what felt like hours, and then, through the darkness, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. Just the empty road, the shadows stretching out like black fingers. My breath caught in my throat as I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Someone, or something, was watching me. Then I heard a knock. It was faint at first, almost like a tap on the window, but then it came again, louder, more insistent. I slowly turned my head to see a figure standing outside my car. It was the gas station attendant, his face now visible in the glow of the dashboard light. His eyes were wide open, too wide, and his expression was twisted into something almost unrecognizable, like a smile, but not a real one. It was the kind of smile that made my skin crawl. I froze, unsure of what to do. My mind was racing, but I couldn't think straight. I watched as he slowly reached up and started to drag his fingers across the window, leaving behind long, streaky marks. The scratching sound was unbearable. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, but the car didn't budge. The figure outside remained motionless, just staring at me with those wide, vacant eyes. The air in the car grew thick, heavy, and I could barely breathe. I couldn't escape. My heart pounded in my chest, and it felt like time had stopped. I didn't know how long I stayed there, but eventually the figure turned away and walked back into the darkness. That was the last time I ever saw that gas station. The next morning, I woke with my car, still on the side of the road. My gas gauge was full and everything seemed normal, like nothing had happened. But I knew better. There was something sinister about that place. I drove away as fast as I could, but even now, every time I pass a gas station, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me.
Next story.
It was a late night in the middle of nowhere. I had been driving for hours on a deserted highway, the only source of light coming from the headlights of my car and the occasional flicker of a distant streetlight. I was on my way to visit my brother, who lived in a small town about 3 hours away from where I was. The drive had been long and uneventful, but at least it was peaceful. Until I saw the gas station. I hadn't passed a single one in over 50 miles. The sign was dim, flickering slightly, but I was desperate for fuel. I pulled into the lot, which looked more like an old relic than a functioning gas station. The pumps were rusty, the building dark, and there wasn't a single car in sight. It was the kind of place you'd only stop at if you had no other choice. I parked next to one of the pumps and stepped out of my car. The night air was thick with the smell of gasoline and decay. I didn't see a soul around, but there was an eerie sound, almost like static, faintly coming from the speakers on the gas pumps. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should just turn around and head back. But then I noticed something that made me think twice. The lights inside the small convenience store flickered on. I wasn't sure why, but it gave me the feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked toward the door, trying not to let the growing unease get to me. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the faint smell of old coffee and stale air hit me. The shelves were cluttered with dusty snacks, and the counter was empty, no one in sight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strange in the silence. No answer. I stood there for a moment, considering whether I should leave and find another station. But the thought of running out of gas in the middle of nowhere was enough to keep me from turning back. I heard a shuffle from the back of the store, and then a figure emerged. At first, I thought it was the clerk, an older man probably in his late 60s with a long, scraggly beard and wild eyes. His clothes were worn, as if he hadn't changed them in days. "You need something?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Yeah, I need to fill up. How much for a full tank?" He didn't answer right away, instead staring at me with a look that made my skin crawl. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "Gas is free tonight, but you have to pay in a different way." I thought he was joking, but there was no laughter in his eyes, just a cold, blank stare. "What do you mean by pay in a different way?" I asked, trying to hide the unease in my voice. "Is this some kind of joke?" The man didn't respond right away. He just kept looking at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. Then, as if snapping out of some trance, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was unnerving, the kind that made you feel like you were being watched by something far more sinister than a tired old gas station clerk. "You'll see soon enough," he muttered, his voice low. I felt a chill run down my spine. My instincts were telling me to leave, but I forced myself to stay. I needed the gas, and I didn't want to appear like a coward. The man motioned for me to follow him outside. I stepped back toward the door, still feeling uneasy, but I couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong. "Just get the gas, and you'll understand," he said, almost as if he was reading my thoughts. Outside, the wind had picked up, making the night feel colder. The dim lights of the station flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. The pump seemed almost alive, like they were waiting for something, or someone. I stood by my car as the man began to fill my tank. The gas flowed unusually slowly, almost as if there was something wrong with the line. But he didn't seem to notice. He was muttering to himself, his voice just barely audible. Suddenly, I heard a noise from behind me. It was soft at first, like someone walking, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. My heart began to race as I turned to look, but there was no one there. Then, without warning, I felt something cold press against the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was no one. I looked at the man filling my tank, but he didn't seem to notice. It was then that I realized something truly terrifying. The gas station had gone completely silent. The wind had stopped, the static from the speakers was gone, and I couldn't hear a single sound. I glanced around the station, my eyes darting nervously, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary, except for one thing. In the corner of my vision, I saw a figure standing near the farthest pump. It was a shadowy silhouette, too dark to make out clearly, but I could feel its eyes on me. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly began to move closer, its steps slow and deliberate. I froze, unable to move, as it closed the distance between us. The gas station clerk didn't seem to notice, still going about his business as if everything was normal. The figure was only a few feet away from me when I saw it. The pale, ghostly face of a man, his eyes hollow and black, staring directly at me. His skin was stretched tight over his skull, his features gaunt and decayed. His mouth opened, and I heard a low, guttural whisper, "Leave this place before it's too late." I stepped back, my heart racing. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to escape, but I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The figure continued to move closer, its footsteps echoing in the silent night. I felt a cold hand grip my wrist, and I turned to see the gas station clerk standing right next to me. His once kind expression was gone, replaced by something darker, more sinister. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice now a low growl. Before I could react, the world around me shifted. The gas station seemed to fade away, replaced by a dark, empty void. I could feel myself falling, deeper and deeper, as if I were being dragged into some abyss. The cold grip on my wrist tightened, and I heard the clerk's voice again, whispering in my ear, "Now, you're part of it, just like the others." I screamed, but no sound escaped my mouth. I was falling faster now, spinning in the darkness, my mind unable to comprehend what was happening. Then, with a jolt, everything stopped. I was back at the gas station, standing in front of my car. The lights were on again, the pumps were functioning normally, and the night air was quiet. But something was wrong. I wasn't alone. The figure from before was still there, standing by the farthest pump, watching me with those empty, hollow eyes. I turned to the clerk, but he was gone. The station was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of the neon lights. I could still feel the cold grip on my wrist, the lingering sensation of being dragged into something terrible. Without thinking, I jumped into my car, slammed the door shut, and sped off into the night. I didn't look back. I don't know what happened that night, but I never stopped at that gas station again. I still drive that same highway to visit my brother, but now I always make sure to pass the station without a second glance. I'm not sure if I was the victim of some twisted joke or if something far darker is lurking there, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler. All I know is this. If you ever find yourself driving down a lonely road in the dead of night and you see a gas station with flickering lights and no cars in sight, don't stop. Don't even look. Just drive on. You don't want to know what's waiting for you there.
Next story.
It was a bright summer evening when I made my way down a long stretch of highway, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon. My phone's GPS indicated that I was about 45 minutes away from my destination, my cousin's wedding reception in a small town a few states over. I had been on the road for hours and was starting to get tired, so when I saw a gas station looming in the distance, I decided to pull in for a quick break. The station looked a bit rundown, the kind of place you'd expect to see on an old, forgotten highway. The sign above the pumps was faded, and the building itself looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in years. There was a single car parked in front of the convenience store, a beat-up sedan that seemed as out of place as the station itself. Still, I needed gas and figured it'd be better to stop here than risk running low. I pulled up to the nearest pump and stepped out of my car. The station was eerily quiet, no one in sight. I could hear the soft hum of the lights overhead and the sound of my shoes tapping against the pavement as I made my way toward the pumps. I glanced over at the convenience store. No lights on inside, but the door was ajar, hanging loosely on its hinges. I could almost smell the faint scent of something rotting, though I convinced myself it was just the heat. I was halfway through filling my tank when I saw him. A man, probably in his late 50s or early 60s, standing just inside the door of the convenience store. He wasn't looking at me, but his posture was odd. His shoulders were hunched, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He just stood there, staring into the dark as though he was waiting for something or someone. "Hey, you all right?" I called out, unsure why I felt the need to ask. It was late, and I hadn't seen anyone at the pumps when I pulled up. The man didn't respond. In fact, he didn't even acknowledge me. His back was turned, but I could feel his presence, an overwhelming sense of being watched, like something wasn't quite right. I finished filling my tank and wiped my hands on my jeans, still watching him. Something about him made me uneasy, so I decided to leave. I'd had my fill of small-town weirdness, but as I turned toward my car, I noticed something strange. The sedan that had been parked in front of the store was gone. It had disappeared completely. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't remember seeing anyone leave, and if they had, they would have passed me on the way out. But there was no one around, just the man standing inside the store and me. I grabbed my keys, ready to leave, but my instincts stopped me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, like I was being pulled into something that was unfolding around me. I glanced back at the convenience store one more time, and this time the man was looking directly at me. His eyes were wide, almost too wide, and the whites of his eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. "Don't go," he said softly, his voice trembling as if he was forcing the words out. "You shouldn't go." I froze, a chill running down my spine. "What do you mean? I'm just getting gas." "You can't leave," he whispered, his eyes never leaving mine. "You're already in it now. You'll never make it." Something in his voice, something in the way he looked at me, made my stomach drop. I couldn't tell if he was warning me or if he was part of whatever twisted game was playing out at this abandoned gas station. I had to leave. Now. Without thinking, I bolted for my car. My hands fumbled as I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I started the engine and peeled out of the parking lot, the tires screeching against the pavement. The highway stretched ahead of me, and for the first few miles, everything seemed normal. The usual quiet of the night road, the gentle hum of my tires on the asphalt. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. I had just overreacted, that's all. The man was probably harmless, just an eccentric who lived in a rundown station. But as I drove, the world around me started to change. The road ahead began to stretch out longer, and I realized that I wasn't passing any familiar landmarks. The trees lining the road, once familiar in their shapes and patterns, now seemed to be closing in on me, their branches reaching out like fingers. I tried to ignore the growing sense of unease, but it was impossible. And then there it was, Another gas station, sitting quietly at the edge of the road. My heart leaped in my chest. How was it possible? I had just left a station. I glanced at my GPS, but it was showing the exact same route. I had barely driven 5 miles since I'd left, yet here I was again, at another gas station that looked just like the one I'd just left. The station wasn't exactly the same. It looked a little more run down, with broken windows and a sagging roof. But it felt wrong. Too wrong. The sign hanging above the pumps was the same faded letters, the same flickering lights. I slowed down, unsure of what to do. Something was terribly off. I should have kept driving, but I couldn't. The same pull, the same strange compulsion was there. I turned my car into the lot and parked. My hands were sweating as I opened the door. The moment I stepped out, the cold night air wrapped around me, thick and heavy. I turned to face the store, and just like before, I saw him. Standing inside the door, his back hunched and his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The same man. But how? How was he here? "You can't leave," he said again, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You're not supposed to leave. You never leave." His eyes were wide again, but now his pupils had turned entirely black, like an abyss. I felt myself rooted to the spot, unable to move, as the sound of static filled the air around me. It buzzed in my ears, disorienting me. "You've entered it now," the man continued, his voice rasping as though he were struggling to speak. "The cycle. The station. It pulls you in and you can't get out." A cold, shuddering sensation swept over me. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The ground seemed to shift beneath me, as though the world itself was warping and changing around me. The static intensified until it was deafening, and then, in a blink, everything stopped. The air grew still. The station was gone. The road, the trees, the man, everything vanished into a complete void. There was nothing left but blackness. Then, as quickly as it had all disappeared, the gas station appeared again, back on the road as if nothing had ever happened, the familiar sign, the same faded lettering, the same silent emptiness. I was no longer driving toward a destination. I was driving in circles.
Next story.
I can still remember the exact moment it all began. I was driving through the back roads in rural Ohio on my way to a small town for a business trip. It was late at night, around 2 a.m., and I had already been on the road for over 6 hours. My car's gas light blinked, warning me that I needed to stop soon. I was deep in the countryside, and there hadn't been a gas station in miles. I started to worry, thinking I might have to pull off the road and wait for someone to pass by. The last thing I wanted was to run out of fuel in the middle of nowhere. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flickering light in the distance. It was a gas station sign. I sighed in relief and decided to head towards it. The station appeared suddenly, looming in the dark with its flickering neon lights barely visible from the road. The moment I pulled into the lot, I noticed how eerie it looked, old and run down, with only one pump working. The surrounding area seemed abandoned. The station's building was small, with a dimly lit office inside. The pavement was cracked, weeds growing between the gaps. It almost felt like it had been shut down for years. As I parked near the pump, I glanced around, but there wasn't a single car in sight. It was just me and the station. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I needed gas, so I got out of my car and started filling up. I remember the air was thick with a musty smell, like a place that hadn't been touched for a long time. When I was almost finished filling the tank, I heard a door creak open. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I saw someone stepping out of the dimly lit office. A man, tall and lanky, with unkempt hair and a weathered face. He was wearing a stained work shirt with the name Steve on it. "Can I help you?" he asked in a raspy voice. I froze for a moment. The guy's voice had an odd, unsettling tone. No, I'm good. Just needed gas," I replied, trying to sound casual. He stared at me for a few seconds, his eyes wide but unblinking. It felt like he was looking right through me. I tried not to make eye contact, but I couldn't help it. There was something about him that felt wrong. You're traveling alone?" he asked, his voice a little too quiet for comfort. "Yeah," I said, starting to feel a little uncomfortable. "Just me." "Well, be careful out here. Strange things happen around these parts," he said, his smile making my skin crawl. He didn't move after that. He just stood there watching me, as if waiting for something. I couldn't get my gas cap back on fast enough. I turned to get back in my car, but before I could reach the door, I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a loud scraping sound, like metal dragging across concrete. Slowly, I turned around and saw a figure moving toward me from the far side of the lot. It was a woman, dressed in tattered clothes. Her long, greasy hair hung in strands over her face, and her arms were outstretched like she was walking in a trance. I froze in place. The woman's face was pale, almost sickly white, and when she lifted her head, I could see her eyes, black, empty holes where her pupils should have been. I wanted to scream, but my throat had gone dry. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground. Steve didn't seem fazed at all. In fact, he smiled. "Ah, there's Emily," he said casually, like he was greeting an old friend. "She's a bit of a wanderer, but she doesn't bite." I wanted to ask what the hell he meant by that, but I couldn't move or speak. The woman's slow, jerky movements were getting closer, and with every step, I felt an icy chill run down my spine. "Steve." "Eve?" I whispered. Who is she?" "That's Emily. She's been here a long time," he said, his voice growing softer. "Don't worry about her. She just likes to watch. She won't hurt you." I didn't believe him. There was something deeply wrong with her. Her lips barely moved, but I swear I heard her whispering, her voice raspy and low, like a wind blowing through a cracked window. The words were barely audible, but I caught fragments of it. "Get out. Now. Leave." I stumbled back toward my car, my heart pounding in my chest. As I tried to open the door, I glanced back at Steve and Emily. She was standing directly in front of him now, her blank eyes still fixed on me. Steve reached out as if he was going to touch her, but she recoiled violently. She hissed at him, an inhuman sound that made my blood run cold. Then, in an instant, everything stopped. The woman froze in place, her body going rigid like a mannequin. Steve's smile faded, and his eyes darkened. He started to approach me slowly, but I had already thrown myself into the driver's seat and locked the door. "Don't leave," Steve called out, his voice now low and guttural. "It's too late." The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I couldn't get my car started fast enough. My hands shook as I turned the key. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I slammed the gas pedal, peeling out of the lot. As I sped away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The gas station was barely visible in the distance, and the flickering lights becoming smaller and smaller. But the image that still haunts me to this day was that of Emily, standing in the lot, her head tilted back at an unnatural angle, her eyes never leaving me. Her mouth was open now, stretched wide, showing rows of sharp yellow teeth. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. But that wasn't the last time I thought about it. Over the next few days, I did some research. I wanted to know if there were any reports of strange occurrences at that gas station. It took some digging, but I eventually found a small local news article from years ago. It turned out that the gas station had been abandoned for decades, and the building was supposed to be condemned. But there had been rumors of strange sightings around that area for years. A woman had gone missing in the 1980s, and some said she had never left the area. They even called her the Wandering Woman. But what really shook me was the mention of Steve. The article said that a man named Steve had worked at the station long before it was shut down, and he had been found dead in the station's office. Authorities said his body showed signs of being mutilated, but there was no explanation for the strange wounds. I never went back to that part of Ohio again, and I never want to. I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't imagining it. The worst part? I'm not sure what's worse, the idea that Steve and Emily were trapped there, or that they might be waiting for the next traveler. I just hope it's not me.
Next story.
It was past midnight when I rolled into the gas station, the kind of hour when every light feels a little too bright and every shadow seems just a little too long. I had been driving for what felt like days, my eyes heavy from the road and my mind foggy. I hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and I was starting to wonder if the world was as empty as it felt. So when I saw the lights of the gas station ahead, I breathed a sigh of relief. This was no ordinary station. It was tucked away in the middle of nowhere, the sign barely visible, a single flickering bulb hanging above the small building. The pumps looked ancient, the kind you'd expect to see in a movie set in the 1980s. But I didn't care. My car was running low on gas, and I just needed to fill up and get back on the road. I pulled up to one of the pumps and shut off the engine. The eerie quiet around me felt like it was pressing in, and I tried to shake it off. The wind whistled through the trees nearby, and the station's single overhead light buzzed in the cold night air. I got out of the car and made my way to the pump. As soon as I approached, I heard something. A soft tapping, almost like a knock on wood. I looked around, trying to locate the source, but there was no one in sight. The station seemed empty. I glanced toward the convenience store at the back of the station, the lights flickering again. The door was slightly ajar. I hadn't seen any cars parked nearby, and the place seemed completely deserted, but something made me feel like I wasn't alone. "Hello?" I called out, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild. No answer. The tapping continued. It wasn't coming from the walls or the ground. It seemed to be coming from the pump itself. I approached it slowly, unnerved but curious. As I got closer, the tapping stopped. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat as I reached out to pull the nozzle from its holder. The second my fingers touched it, I felt it. A jolt, as if static electricity had surged through my body. I yanked my hand back, but the jolt lingered for a moment. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was just a malfunction, something to do with the pump's wiring, but I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Maybe I should just go, I muttered to myself, but I needed gas. I wasn't that far from the next town, but I needed enough fuel to get there. I hesitated, glancing around once more. Then, out of nowhere, a voice. "Need some help?" It came from behind me, and I spun around, startled. There was a man standing in the doorway of the convenience store. He was tall, dressed in a thick jacket, his face half hidden beneath the brim of a worn-out hat. His eyes were dark, too dark, like he hadn't seen the light in years. Yeah, I'm trying to fill up," I said, trying to calm my nerves. I didn't know why I felt so uneasy. I mean, it was just a guy working at the gas station, right? "Come inside," he said, his voice low and steady. "You'll want to pay inside." I glanced at the pumps and then back at the man. Something about his demeanor made my gut twist, but I nodded. I walked toward the store, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the store was even more outdated than the pumps. Dusty shelves lined the walls, and a faint, musty smell lingered in the air. It looked like a place that hadn't seen any business in years. "Over here," the man called, motioning toward the counter at the back of the store. I walked over to the counter, my eyes scanning the dimly lit room. There were no other customers, no cars outside. Just me and him. The man stood behind the counter, staring at me without saying a word. I glanced at the price on the gas pump monitor. It didn't seem right. It was lower than I'd ever seen it before, almost ridiculously cheap. The pump's already turned on," I said, looking back at the man. He didn't respond at first. He just kept staring, his dark eyes not moving, almost unnervingly still. I felt my pulse quicken, and I suddenly felt like I needed to leave. "You don't want to pay for it," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "What?" I asked, taken aback. "I just need gas. I'm heading out. Can you just ring me up?" The man took a long pause before responding, his hands slowly reaching under the counter. I flinched, unsure of what he was about to do. But then he pulled out a small, tattered notebook, the pages yellowed with age. He flipped it open and began writing something in it, muttering to himself. "You'll be back," he whispered, his voice so low it barely registered. "They always come back." I stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "I don't understand. What do you mean?" The man looked up at me then, and his eyes seemed different. Darker, like there was something lurking inside them, something that wasn't human. His lips twisted into a grin. "You'll see soon enough. They all do." A chill ran down my spine as I stood there, paralyzed by his gaze. My hands shook, and I suddenly felt like I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, to get out of there, but something kept me rooted in place. Then, without warning, I heard it. A soft sound at first, like footsteps shuffling in the back of the store. I turned toward the noise, but there was no one there. And then, I saw it. A shadow, long and thin, moving across the wall behind the man. It wasn't his shadow. It was something else, something unnatural. It slithered along the floor, and I felt my blood run cold. I blinked, and the shadow was gone. The man smiled wider, his teeth sharp and yellow in the dim light. "They always come back," he said again. "Every time." I didn't wait to hear any more. I ran for the door, throwing it open and slamming it behind me. I jumped into my car, my hands trembling as I started the engine. Without looking back, I sped away from the station, my tires screeching on the asphalt. For miles, I drove without seeing another soul. But something stayed with me, something I couldn't shake. The voice, the shadow, the feeling that something was chasing me, lurking just beyond my vision. I don't know what that man was. I don't know what he meant or what was following me. But I can tell you this much. I never stopped at a gas station that late at night again. And if you're ever driving alone on a dark, lonely road and you see a gas station with no cars and a flickering sign, don't stop. You might not like what you find there.
Next story.
I had been driving for hours, the road stretching endlessly in front of me, the only company being the occasional rustle of the trees and the hum of my tires on the pavement. It was well past midnight, and the quiet of the country road seemed to stretch on for eternity. I had missed the last few exits, and the GPS on my phone had long since lost its signal. I wasn't familiar with this area, and to make matters worse, I hadn't seen another car in what felt like forever. My tank was running low, and I was starting to panic, realizing I might be stuck in the middle of nowhere with no gas stations in sight. That's when I spotted it. A dimly lit gas station appeared in the distance, an oasis in the otherwise desolate landscape. I sighed in relief as I pulled into the lot, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the ground. The station was small, run down, and looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. The pumps were ancient and the building was dusty, its paint peeling from years of neglect. There were no other cars in sight, no signs of life, just an empty stretch of asphalt and a building that seemed to exude a sense of foreboding. I parked my car at the pump and stepped out, glancing around. Everything was silent, too silent. The air felt thick with an unsettling stillness. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you were being watched, like something was waiting just beyond your field of vision. I walked up to the pump, and as I began to fill my tank, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I looked around once more, but there were no signs of movement. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that someone or something was watching me. It was then that I heard a noise, a soft, creaking sound coming from the direction of the store. I turned, expecting to see a door or window open, but there was nothing. Just the wind, carrying the scent of dust and old wood. The door to the convenience store was slightly ajar. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was impossible to ignore. The dim light inside flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw something move behind the glass. But when I blinked, there was nothing. I shook my head, trying to calm myself down. It was probably just my imagination. I had been driving for too long, and my mind was starting to play tricks on me. Still, I couldn't resist the urge to glance over toward the door. That's when I saw her. A woman standing in the doorway of the store, her figure half hidden in the shadows. She was tall, dressed in a long coat, and her face was obscured by her long, dark hair. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me. I felt a jolt of unease shoot through me. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should I go inside and ask if there was anyone there? Should I ignore her and leave? But before I could decide, she stepped forward, her feet making no sound as she crossed the threshold. She didn't speak. She just walked slowly toward me, her gaze never leaving mine. Her eyes were unnaturally dark, almost black, and there was something about the way she moved that sent a chill down my spine. Her presence felt wrong, unnatural, like she wasn't meant to be here, or maybe like she wasn't real at all. "Can I help you?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound calm. The woman didn't answer. She simply stopped a few feet away from me, standing perfectly still, her eyes never breaking contact. I took a step back, my heart racing in my chest. Something was off about this woman, something that made every instinct in my body scream at me to leave, to get back in my car and drive as fast as I could. I glanced around, hoping for some sign of help, but the station was as empty as it had been when I first arrived. There were no cars, no people, just me and this woman standing in the dark. Without warning, she raised her hand, pointing at something behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but when I looked, there was nothing there. Just the same dark stretch of road and the empty gas station. When I turned back, the woman was gone. I blinked, feeling a wave of confusion and panic wash over me. Had I imagined her? Was I just seeing things? I looked around again, but she was nowhere to be found. I quickly finished filling my tank, not wanting to stay another second longer. I hopped into my car, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing behind me, but the road was empty, just the faint glow of the gas station's lights fading behind me. I drove as fast as I could, not daring to look back. But no matter how far I went, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that gas station, something lingered in the air, a feeling of unease, a sense that I was being followed. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and the more I drove, the more I felt like I wasn't going anywhere. The trees around me blurred, and the moon above became the only constant, casting long, ghostly shadows across the road. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I saw the glow of another gas station up ahead. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the familiar flicker of lights. I slammed on the brakes, my mind racing as I realized what I had just passed. A gas station that looked exactly like the one I had just left. I looked around in panic, trying to make sense of it. This couldn't be happening. I had driven for miles. There was no way I was back at the same place. But there it was. The same gas station, the same dimly lit sign, the same eerie silence. I drove past slowly, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I couldn't stop. I couldn't go back there. But as I glanced in my rearview mirror, I saw her again. The woman. Standing in the doorway of the station, her dark eyes fixed on me. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. I don't know how long I've been driving. I don't know if I'll ever get out of this loop. The gas stations keep appearing. Familiar, quiet, with that woman watching me from the doorway. The road keeps stretching on, but I can never seem to leave. I don't know if anyone will ever find me.
Next story.
I was on a cross-country road trip, heading to visit my sister in a small town about 3 states away. I'd been driving all day, and as the sun began to set, I found myself on a desolate stretch of highway, surrounded by miles of empty fields and an occasional farmhouse in the distance. There was nothing out here but the road and the endless horizon. My fuel gauge was dipping dangerously close to empty, and there hadn't been a gas station in miles. I glanced at my phone. No signal, not even a weak bar of service. That's when I saw it, a small, rundown gas station in the distance. The lights on the sign flickered, and the building looked like it hadn't been renovated in decades. But desperate times, right? I pulled up to the pumps, my car's engine giving off a faint sputter. As I stepped out, I immediately noticed how silent everything was. The air felt thick, almost oppressive. No cars in sight, no movement at all, just a stillness that made me uneasy. I could hear the faint hum of the lights above me and the sound of my own breathing. I glanced around and saw the small convenience store attached to the station, old, with peeling paint on the walls and the door slightly ajar. I took a deep breath and made my way toward the pump. As I inserted the nozzle into my tank, I caught a glimpse of something odd out of the corner of my eye. A figure, standing by the entrance to the store, watching me. I froze, my hand still on the nozzle, my heart skipping a beat. The figure was a man, but his face was obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me. "Hey, can I help you with something?" I called out, trying to sound casual. But the man didn't respond. He just stood there, still as stone, his hands tucked in his jacket pockets. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. It wasn't just the strange silence of the place, it was the way he was staring at me. It felt like he was waiting for something, or maybe, even worse, expecting something. I quickly finished pumping my gas and started to head back to my car, feeling increasingly uneasy. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. But before I could open my car door, the man finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, as though he didn't want to be heard. "You shouldn't be here." I turned to face him, my heart hammering in my chest. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice shaking, his head tilted slightly as if he was studying me. "This place is cursed. People who stop here, they don't leave." A cold wave of dread washed over me. I took a step back toward my car, instinctively locking the door. "Look, I don't know what you're talking about. I just need gas. I'm in a hurry." The man's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. "Once you enter, you can't leave. It's already too late." My hands trembled as I gripped the door handle. "What do you mean?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it or if the man's words were really sinking in, but something in my gut told me that this was no ordinary gas station. Without warning, I heard a loud bang from inside the store. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. A figure appeared in the doorway, moving quickly, but it wasn't the man. This person looked wrong. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, and their face was obscured by shadows. They stepped closer to the light, and I could make out the details of their features, twisted, distorted. Their eyes were black, completely black, with no whites. It was like staring into an abyss. I felt my heart leap into my throat. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs were frozen. I couldn't move. The air around me felt thick and suffocating, like the very atmosphere was pressing in on me. Then, as if in slow motion, the figure spoke. Their voice was a low growl, an unnatural rasp that sent chills down my spine. "You should have listened to him," they said. "You can never leave. Once you stop here, you're one of us." Suddenly, I was aware of the darkness that had been creeping around the edges of my vision. The station wasn't just an old, rundown place. It was alive. It wasn't just the people who were trapped here. If the land, the road, everything was part of it, pulling me in, suffocating me. I snapped out of my daze and dove into my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the door shut, quickly starting the engine. The gas station faded into the background as I sped away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. But even as I raced down the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the man. It wasn't just the shadowy figure. It was the station itself. Something had changed in the air after I left. Something that made the world feel wrong. As I drove, I tried to shake off the panic rising in my chest. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the whole thing was just a strange encounter at a remote gas station. But as I passed by mile after mile of empty highway, I realized something. I hadn't seen any other cars, not a single one. My phone still had no service, no signal. I drove for what felt like hours, my headlights cutting through the darkness, but still no cars appeared. The world around me felt unreal, like I was in some kind of dream. I tried to look at my GPS, but the screen was frozen, just stuck on the same location, showing no movement. And that's when I realized I was stuck. I wasn't moving forward. I wasn't going anywhere. No matter how far I drove, the world stayed the same. The same empty road, the same lack of people or cars. It was like the gas station had pulled me into its grasp and wouldn't let go. I hit the brakes, my heart thumping in my chest as the realization set in. The man's words echoed in my head. "Once you stop here, you're one of us." The headlights flickered, casting long shadows in front of me. I tried to turn the car around, but the road ahead twisted and stretched no matter how many times I turned the wheel. The gas station. The man. The figures. They were all there, waiting for me in the dark. And no matter how hard I tried to leave, I knew, deep down, that it was already too late.
Next story.
I was driving through the mountains on a solo road trip, the kind of journey where you go off the beaten path and try to discover something new. The sun was beginning to set, casting an amber glow across the sky, and the winding roads were surrounded by dense trees, with barely any other cars in sight. My GPS was giving me strange errors, cutting in and out, but I wasn't concerned. I preferred being off the grid anyway. What I didn't realize was that this sense of isolation would soon turn into something far more unsettling. As the road curved around another bend, I saw a flickering light ahead. At first, I thought it might be a reflection or the fading sunlight, but as I got closer, I realized it was a gas station. It was small and old, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The sign was half lit, the letters barely visible in the dimming light. There was a solitary pump, and in the distance I could see the outline of the convenience store attached to the station. I had been driving for hours, and my gas tank was almost empty. This place was a lifeline, though something about it felt off. The lights flickered again as I pulled into the parking lot. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be here. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I brushed it off, deciding it was just the long drive getting to me. I parked next to the pump, got out of my car, and went to fill up. The station was eerily quiet. No hum of background noise, no bustling customers, just the sound of the pump clicking as it filled my tank. It was so still, I could hear the leaves rustling in the trees, and the distant sound of a creek flowing somewhere nearby. As I stood there, a man appeared at the door of the convenience store. He looked old, maybe in his 70s, with a long white beard and weathered skin. His clothes were simple, old jeans and a plaid shirt, but his presence felt strangely heavy. He didn't move or say anything at first, just stood there, watching me with a steady gaze. I felt a pang of unease, but I told myself it was just a lonely old man running the station, probably tired from a long day. "Can I help you?" Trying to break the silence. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "Folks don't usually stop here at night," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Yeah, I didn't plan on it," I replied, nervously glancing around. "I was just running low on gas." He didn't respond right away, but his gaze seemed to pierce through me like he was weighing something in his mind. Then he slowly nodded and said, "You should leave. It's not safe here at night." I laughed it off. "I'm just filling up, then I'll be gone. No harm done." His eyes narrowed. "You don't understand. No one who stops here at night leaves." The air around me seemed to grow colder, and I suddenly felt that uncomfortable prickling sensation again, the feeling of being watched. I glanced around, but the parking lot was still empty. I turned back to the man, but now his gaze wasn't just unsettling, it was almost predatory. His stare held something darker, something I couldn't place, like he was warning me about something I couldn't see. I swallowed hard, my hand on the gas pump shaking. "I'm sure I'll be fine," I said, trying to sound confident. "I've been on the road for hours, just need to get back." He shook his head slowly, as if pitying me. "Once you're here, you can't leave." His words felt like a weight, a truth I didn't want to believe. I pulled the pump out of my car and put it back, my thoughts racing. "I don't need any help, thanks," I said, climbing back into my car and starting the engine. But as I was about to pull away, I saw the old man move to the side of the building, out of sight. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the ground itself. My tires vibrated slightly as if the earth were shifting beneath me. The air grew thick, and my breath felt shallow as I shifted into drive and started to pull away. But the road didn't look the same. The trees on the side of the road looked wrong. Their shapes seemed distorted, like the branches were reaching for me. The winding path ahead of me seemed to stretch endlessly, further than I remembered. I tried to look at my GPS, but it was frozen, stuck on the same spot, right where the gas station was. Panic started to rise in my chest as I pressed harder on the gas pedal. The road was curving unnaturally, and no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was going in circles. I looked in the rearview mirror, and for a moment, I saw the faint outline of the gas station, just behind me. No matter how many times I turned, no matter how many miles I drove, it was always there, lurking in the distance like a phantom. I gripped the wheel, desperate to break free, but then my headlights flickered. The road was completely dark ahead of me, the trees closing in. My vision was narrowing. And there, at the end of the road, I saw it again. The flickering lights of the gas station. It was as if the whole landscape was folding in on itself, trapping me. I slammed my foot on the brake, but the car didn't stop. It continued to roll forward as though the road itself had taken control. I tried everything, shifting gears, slamming the brakes, but it was like I was stuck in some endless loop, the gas station always appearing just ahead of me. Finally, the car rolled to a stop. I was back at the station. My heart was pounding in my chest as I looked around. The man had vanished. The lights were still flickering, and the door to the convenience store was wide open. I looked at my phone again, still no signal. I had to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again. A voice, soft and distant, coming from the edge of the parking lot. "You shouldn't have stayed. No one leaves." I looked around, but the old man wasn't there anymore. The trees loomed closer, their shapes almost human, as if they were reaching out toward me. That's when I realized I wasn't going anywhere. The road had become a maze, and I was trapped in it. The gas station wasn't just a stop on the highway. It was the center of something, an endless cycle I couldn't escape. I would never leave.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts. I was always the kind of person who laughed at those stories, spooky tales people told around campfires or on quiet nights when the wind howled through the trees. But that night, I learned the hard way that some things are better left unexplained. It was late autumn when it happened, the air crisp and the nights longer than usual. I had been working late, finishing up a project for my job, and I was driving back home to my apartment after a long day. It was one of those rare moments where I had to take a back road to avoid the traffic. The highway was deserted. The only sounds were the hum of my car and the rustle of dead leaves on the pavement. The drive was peaceful, almost soothing, but I was exhausted. As I drove deeper into the woods, I noticed a strange thing, a light in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a reflection or a trick of my tired eyes, but as I got closer, the light became clearer. A gas station. I didn't remember ever seeing one on this stretch of road before. I wasn't particularly low on gas, but it had been a while since I'd seen another human being. The thought of stopping felt oddly comforting, especially in such an isolated area. I pulled into the parking lot. The station was small, old-fashioned. The neon sign above flickered intermittently, barely casting enough light to see the pumps. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, yet the lights were on. There was no other car in sight. I stepped out of the car, unsure if I should be worried or relieved. The air smelled musty, like old wood and gasoline. As I walked toward the pumps, I heard the creak of the station door opening. A man stepped out. He was tall and thin with a weathered face. His clothes were old, like they belonged in a time long past. The name tag on his chest read Rick. His eyes were wide, unsettlingly so, and he gave me a long, intense stare before speaking. "Need some gas?" he asked in a voice that was too quiet, almost as if he wasn't used to speaking. I nodded, half expecting him to say something else, but he didn't. Instead, he silently began to pump the gas. There was an eerie stillness in the air, the kind that makes you second-guess everything around you. I felt my stomach tighten, but I couldn't quite pinpoint why. "Thanks," I said, trying to break the silence. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood there staring at me, his eyes unnerving in their intensity. After a moment, he walked back into the store without a word. I took a deep breath, hoping I was just being paranoid. I finished fueling my car and walked back to the driver's side, still feeling that strange tension in the air. That's when I heard it. A loud thump. It came from inside the station, followed by a scraping sound, like something or someone was dragging itself across the floor. I froze. The door to the station creaked open again, but this time it wasn't Rick who appeared. It was something else. A figure, hunched over, emerging from the shadows of the store. It looked human, but not quite. Its arms were unnaturally long, and its fingers were stretched, like they had been distorted beyond recognition. It was dragging itself toward me, its movements slow but deliberate, and its breath was shallow, like it was struggling to exist. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The figure stopped just short of the pump and raised its head. Its face, if you could call it a face, was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. Its mouth opened, revealing a row of teeth that were far too sharp, far too long. Before I could react, the figure let out a sound. A low, raspy whisper, like it was trying to speak, but couldn't. Then it took a step toward me, dragging itself closer. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I stumbled backward, my eyes still fixed on it. Suddenly, a loud voice interrupted the tension. "Get in your car!" Rick shouted from the door of the station. His voice was harsh, like he was warning me. I didn't need any more encouragement. I sprinted back to my car, fumbled with the keys, and started the engine. As I peeled out of the lot, I looked in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure chasing me, but there was nothing, just the dark emptiness of the road. I didn't stop again. I drove straight home, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The whole way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me. When I finally got home, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, while too shaken to sleep. The next day, I decided to look up the gas station. I had to know what had happened there, why it looked so abandoned despite being in operation, and who that thing was. When I searched online, there was no mention of any gas station on that stretch of road. Nothing, not even a map entry. Confused and frustrated, I called the local authorities, asking about any gas stations on that road. The dispatcher's voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "There's no gas station on that road, sir," he said. Not for the last 30 years. I hung up, my mind racing. How had I ended up at a place that didn't exist? I thought I must have been imagining it. But when I went to grab my car keys, I noticed something strange. The gas cap had been removed, and there was a piece of paper inside it, folded neatly. I opened the paper. It read, "You shouldn't have stopped. Now you're part of the collection." I never went back to that road. I moved to a different city shortly after, trying to put it all behind me. But sometimes when I drive at night, I feel the hairs on my neck stand up, and I wonder if that gas station is still out there, waiting for its next visitor.
Next story.
I don't know what made me stop that night. Maybe it was the dim lights in the distance, or the fact that I was running on empty. Whatever it was, I should have trusted my instincts and kept driving. But I didn't. I pulled into that old, rundown gas station at the edge of the road. It was a long stretch of highway, no other cars for miles. The station looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The pump was crooked, the parking lot cracked with weeds poking through the pavement. I had passed it several times before, but this time I needed gas, and I wasn't about to make it all the way to the next town. As soon as I parked, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The place felt off. The wind was still, and the only noise was the soft hum of the flickering fluorescent lights above me. There wasn't a soul in sight, not even a stray cat or a bird. Nothing. It was eerie. I grabbed my wallet, locked my car, and approached the station's door. It creaked open with an unnatural slowness, like it hadn't been opened in years. Inside, the lights buzzed above me, and I could hear the faint sound of a radio playing somewhere in the back of the store. It sounded like a news report, but the voice was muffled, distant. I called out, "Hello?" but no one answered. A figure appeared at the counter. It was a woman, but she looked wrong. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale, almost sickly. She stared at me as if she'd been waiting for me, but she didn't say anything. The silence was uncomfortable, like she was somehow aware of my hesitation. "Just need to pay for the gas," I said, my voice sounding much too loud in the quiet of the station. She nodded slowly, still not speaking. I noticed her fingers twitching slightly as if she were trying to decide whether or not to reach for something. The strange thing was, I didn't see any registers or computers, just a stack of paper and an old cash box. I paid with cash, avoiding her eyes. Something about her presence made me feel unsafe, like I was intruding on something private. When I finished, I turned quickly and headed back to my car, eager to leave. The whole place was unsettling, but I had gas now, so I could get back on the road. Just as I reached my car, I heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor of the store. It was slow, deliberate. I didn't stop to look back, but I could feel her eyes on me, even from the parking lot. I started my car, trying to ignore the strange feeling in my chest. The engine sputtered for a second, and I swore under my breath. Just my luck. I tried to turn the key again, but nothing happened. Panic began to creep in, and I tried once more. Still nothing. I turned to look around, half expecting to see someone standing outside my window. There was no one, just the dark, empty road stretching out before me. I got out of the car, hoping it was just a loose connection. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, soft and slow. I turned around, and there she was, the woman from the store. She was standing in the doorway, her hands folded in front of her, her expression unchanged. I froze. "You okay?" I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. She didn't respond. Instead, she looked down at the ground as if trying to decide what to say. Then slowly, she lifted her gaze, and I saw it. Her eyes weren't normal. There was something wrong with them. They were cloudy, like they were reflecting something that shouldn't be there. I backed up a few steps, trying to make my way back to the car. "I think I'll just leave," I said, my voice shaking. But before I could get in, she spoke, her voice low and cold. "You can't leave." The words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what she meant, but I didn't care. I ran back to my car, hoping the engine would start. This time it did. I slammed the gear shift into drive and sped off, heart pounding in my chest. But as I drove, something strange started happening. I looked at the rearview mirror and saw the gas station still behind me. I blinked and looked again. It was as if the gas station was following me. I could see the lights flickering in the mirror. The woman standing in the doorway, just watching. I panicked, gripping the steering wheel tighter as I accelerated, but the gas station remained in the mirror, getting closer with each passing second. No matter how fast I drove, it was always just behind me, like a dark shadow I couldn't escape. I could hear the radio in the car crackling, and then, through the static, I heard the woman's voice again. "You can't leave," she whispered, so faint that I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over, turned off the car, and sat there in the dark, shaking. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I was not going back to that gas station. I sat there for what felt like hours trying to gather my thoughts, but every time I closed my eyes, I could still see the lights in the rearview mirror, still hear her voice. When I finally started the car again, I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, and even then, I felt that sense of dread gnawing at me. The whole experience felt like a nightmare, but every part of me knew it was real. I never passed that gas station again, and I never will. But I sometimes wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to stop, waiting for the next person to make the mistake I made.
Next story.
It happened on a night I'll never forget, driving down a stretch of desolate highway in the middle of nowhere. I was on my way to visit a friend in a neighboring state, and the journey had been long. It had been hours since I passed the last town, and I was starting to feel that sense of loneliness that comes with being on empty roads. It was past midnight, and I was beginning to lose focus. My eyes kept drifting, and I knew I had to stop soon. Just as I was about to pull off at the next exit, I saw it. A gas station, glowing faintly in the distance. I sighed with relief. The gas light on my dashboard had been blinking for miles, and I wasn't sure I'd make it much longer. The gas station was older, one of those roadside relics that had seen better days. It had the standard neon sign, flickering with the word "open" in bold red letters. But something about it didn't seem right. The sign buzzed louder than normal, almost as if it was struggling to stay on. The place seemed out of place, stuck in time, like it didn't belong on this highway at all. I pulled up to the pump, and as I stepped out of the car, I noticed how quiet everything was. There were no cars in the lot, no sounds of life, just the faint hum of the neon lights. The air felt still, too still. I walked toward the pump, ready to fill up and get back on the road, when the door to the station's tiny office creaked open. Out stepped a man, tall, thin, and wearing a dark uniform with a faded name tag that read Jack. His face was pale, his eyes hollow like he hadn't seen sunlight in ages. He didn't smile as he approached me, just gave me a slow, deliberate look. "Need some gas?" he asked, his voice hoarse like he hadn't spoken in days. "Yeah, just need to fill up," I replied, a little unsure why I felt so uncomfortable around him. He nodded slowly, and without another word, he began to pump the gas. I stood there, watching him, the silence around us getting heavier by the second. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I glanced around, looking for any sign of life, but there was no one else in sight. As Jack finished filling my tank, he said, "You don't look like you belong here." I wasn't sure how to respond to that. His tone was strange, almost accusatory. "I'm just passing through," I said, trying to keep things casual. "You should be careful out here," he warned, his eyes locking onto mine. "People who stop here don't always leave the same." I froze. His words hung in the air like a dark omen. Before I could ask what he meant, he turned abruptly and walked back into the office without another word. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. I started to get back in my car, but as I did, I heard a sound. A faint scratching noise, almost like fingernails scraping against metal. It came from the direction of the station's small restroom at the far end of the lot. I hesitated. Something in my mind told me to ignore it and leave, but I couldn't. It was as if some unseen force was pulling me toward that restroom. I don't know why I did it, but I walked toward it. The closer I got, the louder the scratching became. It was constant, relentless, like something or someone was trying to claw its way out. I reached the door, and with one hand, I turned the handle. The door creaked open. What I saw inside stopped me in my tracks. There was nothing at first, just an empty, dimly lit bathroom. But as I looked closer, I saw the shadows moving in the corners. It wasn't just the dim lighting playing tricks on my eyes. There were shapes, figures shifting in the dark. And then I saw it. A figure, A figure hunched over in the farthest stall, its hands scraping against the wall, its body twisted in unnatural angles. I couldn't see its face, but I could hear it, guttural, low, and inhuman, breathing in short bursts. It didn't sound like a person at all. I took a step back, my heart racing. Then the figure stopped moving, and for a moment, I thought it had noticed me. My legs were shaking, but I managed to turn and run back to my car, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't even look back. I put the car in drive and sped off as fast as I could. My mind was racing, and I couldn't shake the image of that thing in the bathroom. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was what happened when I glanced in my rearview mirror. The gas station was gone. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but as I drove farther down the road, I realized I couldn't see the station anymore. The lights were gone. The sign, flickering open, was no longer there. It was as if the gas station had never existed. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I had been driving too long. But when I reached the next town, I pulled over to the side of the road and checked my phone. I looked up the name of the gas station, hoping to see some record of it on Google Maps or in an online directory. But there was nothing. No mention of the place anywhere. I drove past that stretch of highway several times after that, but the station was never there again. To this day, I don't know what I encountered that night. All I know is that the man, Jack, was real. The rest of it, the figure in the restroom, the vanishing station, still haunts me, and I've never stopped at a gas station in the middle of nowhere again.